You're listening to CoAngler's Garage. Today we have one of the most successful coanglers in the history of our sport with us. It's Jack Farage. Jack's won really an absurd number of boats fishing from the Backdeck. And in today's podcast, recorded on May 7th, he shares some tournament winning strategies and tactics from Western waters like Clear Lake, California Delta, Lake Havasu, Lake Oroville, Lake Shasta, and more. So sit back, relax. Jack's going to drop a lot of knowledge here. Hey, everybody. Welcome to CoAngler's Garage. We have a treat for you today. With me today is Jack Farage, who you can tell by looking at the mantle over his head is a rather successful coangler here on the West Coast. And that's an understatement. Just looking at his MLF body of work, he's fished a total of 44 events. And over the course of that period of time has 16 top 10s, which translates to 36% of those events he was in the top 10, and a whopping 5 career wins. So that's more than 1 out of every 10 events this guy won at the end of the day, taking home a boat. Probably in all of those. So, there aren't too many people across the country who have accomplished that from the back deck. And so I'm thrilled to have him here with us today. Jack, welcome to the show. And thanks so much for joining us.
Thank you so much for having me.
With most everybody we have on here, we talk a little bit about how they first got interested in fishing, and then also first started fishing tournaments from the back deck. Could you tell us a little bit about how you got interested in fishing?
Yes. So I got into fishing, from my childhood. I used to go walk the banks at the percolation ponds in San Jose.
Yeah.
And kind of graduated to a car at some point and started hitting Calero, Lexington, and some of those lakes, Anderson. And after doing a bunch of walking around the banks, I ended up getting myself a float tube, which now is the kayak, right?
Yeah.
And started doing some tournaments off the float tube with coyote bait and tackle.
Mm-hmm.
And I just fell in love with it. Always loved catching fish, starting from carp to one day actually catching a bass in the percolation ponds, where that kind of got me really intrigued into the sport.
Yeah. So that's awesome. And for those who may be in other parts of the country, the percolation ponds and Calero and some of the other places he mentioned are around San Jose, California, in Northern California. And I myself have spent a lot of time walking the bank at Calero before
Nice.
I got a bass boat a little while back. And so I think done a lot of that. I grew up in San Diego, fishing farm ponds and some of the lakes down there. So I can relate to what you're describing. So how did you end up jumping into tournaments?
So back then I actually started doing club tournaments. Mainly the first club event was Bass Busters.
Yeah, the Santa Clara
Bass
Busters. Yeah.
Yes. So I fished that for 1 year. I ended up taking Rookie of the Year, and then loved it so much and kind of wanted to push myself to the bigger events. And at the same time, I was working in marketing for a computer chip company. So I couldn't really do as many tournaments as a lot of buddies did at the time. They do team tournaments and whatnot.
Yeah.
So I just allocated it to competitive pro-ams and jumped into a few shared weight events.
Yeah.
At the time, I think it was Juan Bass, Western Bass, and started learning different ways to catch the bass.
Yeah.
And so that was fun for me. Was able to contribute in some event to help the pros out, and some of the events they helped me out. So
yeah,
that was kind of cool. And once I felt comfortable and at the same time, my job at the time let me telecommute. So I made a very important move in my fishing career to Discovery Bay, California, and actually lived on a private pond inside Discovery Bay that
Hmm.
was loaded with bass.
Yeah.
And at the time, I was just got into a relationship with my wife now, and my days of fishing got a lot shorter
Hmm.
because I was actually stepped into a fatherhood. My oldest daughter was 2 at the time. I couldn't get out as much, so I made that move to Discovery Bay, and I was able to still put in the time on the water while raising a family
Hmm.
and working. So
Yeah.
that helped out a lot. And as you know, more time on the water will help you get good and better at events and end up winning some of those boats.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, it doesn't necessarily always translate to winning some of those boats, but obviously for you it has.
Yes. Well, I really, my biggest thing about living on that lake is I was so interested in learning all kinds of techniques. And every time I learned a technique in, say, some of those pro-ams I was in, I would bring it back and practice that on that body of water
Yeah.
that I lived on. And that was very important to do. And at the same time, I would take those techniques and also try to figure out how to how other techniques worked while a certain technique was working the best,
Hmm. Hmm.
and get a good feel for what bad what uh, what a bad technique is for that specific period, whether it's pre-spawn, post-spawn,
Okay.
and um, and put it side by side with a winning technique. So I'm kind of rambling, but
That's okay.
mainly it's figuring out how to catch them and to win an event. And then also at the same time, which I think a lot of people don't do, is throw different techniques that I would think might work and then find out that it's not working. But
Hmm.
then they would also help me know how to get to the technique I'm on right now. For instance, if I went to a body of water and didn't know what was really going on, and then I started catching them on a certain technique, but they weren't really eating the bait right, or
Hmm.
they weren't really chasing, or and then I would go, oh, when they do this, I can do that,
Okay.
and I was able to put together a good recipe for each event when
Yeah.
I moved into the tournament, whether it was at Clear Lake, Shasta, Oroville, it didn't matter.
Yeah. It's interesting. So, for those who maybe in other parts of the country, Discovery Bay is more or less a planned community that's on the California Delta, and the lake that Jack was describing is essentially a pretty good sized pond, slash small lake that's surrounded by housing in that Discovery Bay community that I guess is connected to the Delta, Jack, by some
Yeah.
system of pipes, but so
Yes.
maybe some water that moves in and out, but I don't think it's tidal like the Delta. Is that right? I haven't fished it.
No, it's not tidal. It's
Yeah.
just like they drain it maybe down a little bit during the winter, so you can work on your docks. But
Okay.
story time is it's up high, and what's interesting about that lake is we used to host a bunch of events on it,
Yeah.
and it would be like the most we've had was 8 boats,
Yeah.
and it would be all electric only.
Yeah.
And I've had some of the best fishermen on there. I don't know if you remember Bill Spence,
Uh-huh.
Art Rowland, his
Awesome.
sons
Yeah.
Brian. So we've had some good competition on that body of water, and that kind of helped out a little bit.
Yeah.
Not blowing so much money on events, but actually learning
Yeah.
by doing little turkey shoots.
Yeah. That's neat. So I'm curious, you mentioned a lot of practice on that body of water and its impact on your fishing and tournaments on really a diverse set of lakes. So we're blessed in Northern California with everything from, tidal, lots of grass on the Delta, Clear Lake, mostly shallow, lots of grass, but a lot of different things you can do there. Mother
Yes.
lode lakes and Shasta. And, you've won on Shasta, and we'll talk a little bit more about that later. But I'm curious, how fishing on that pond or lake at Discovery Bay impacted your Shasta fishing, because it's not completely straightforward to me why that connection would be there.
Yeah. So basically, on that lake, I don't have the depth as Shasta,
Yeah.
but I would get some very clear water.
Okay.
Some years it'd be very clear,
Yeah.
and then I would be able to kind of um, use it for Shasta, for instance. Like I remember before the Shasta event, or even Oroville, some of the tournaments, kind of what I thought would happen on those lakes. I would make sure I go in my backyard and 2-3 weeks before that event and practice, say, for instance, like my finesse fishing,
Mm-hmm.
whether it's going to be a shaky head or just the bread and butter tools that I was going to use for that event. I would put that rod in my hand and get really comfortable with it and get all the kinks out,
Mm-hmm.
so to speak.
Mm-hmm.
And then when I showed up there, um, I was ready to be able to use that spinning rod, like
Yeah.
better than most people did.
Yeah. Interesting. So it sounds like, you put a lot of effort in practice wise, but it wasn't always on the body of water where the tournament was. In most cases, were you also showing up at the tournament a couple days in advance?
Yeah, I would give
Yeah.
myself one day. Most of the time, I got one day of practice. Sometimes I got lucky and I got a couple of days of
Yeah.
practice. So that helped out a lot. But mainly, like practicing on that private lake, what helped me was I would be able to go for a couple of hours one day and kind of figure out the bite, the finesse bite, and then kind of fish the next morning before work, and then figure out how that bite changed.
Yeah.
And I was able to use, say, for instance, if I was using a drop shot, the drop shot from yesterday changed to the next day.
Yeah.
So, yeah, what I mean by that, whether it was presentation, it was color of water,
Yeah.
I was able to make those changes quickly
Mm-hmm.
instead of, it took me like 2 weeks to figure out how I
Yeah.
can catch them again, by the way, that's how I started on that lake.
Okay.
I would be able to learn one technique and catch them on that, and then it would take me like a few days to figure out another
Yeah.
technique and so on. But I got it down to where I can kind of vary my retrieves from day to day, and
Mm-hmm.
that helped me a lot in events
Awesome.
that I fished.
Yeah. So let's dive into the events a little bit. And it's a long list, so I have to like look at notes here. It's, if there were
I took some notes myself, so I'm
just a
gonna put,
couple wins, I probably could keep it all in my head, but in this case, got to look at the notes. So how about if we go chronologically? Can you talk a little bit about, I think Oroville was your first win, is that right?
no, I actually
Or
I fished the Bassmasters prior to FLW, and I've won 2 boats fishing the Bassmasters also. So my first win was on the California Delta
yeah.
years ago, and then my second win was on Clear Lake.
Okay. Okay.
So, and then I also made a championship on the Alabama River
Mm-hmm.
and took a third in that one
Awesome.
back east. Yeah, so that was pretty cool before I started doing the FLWs.
Yeah. And then on the FLW / now MLF World Toyota Series and its predecessors, you've got a Havasu win, an Oroville win, a couple Deltas, and Shasta.
Shasta,
So,
Clear Lake, yeah,
yeah. So the thing that really stands out to me is that these are all very different types of, bodies of water
yes,
that require across the totality of those bodies of water an awful lot of versatility. And so maybe we can talk a little bit about your success on each of the bodies of water, and then after that talk a little bit about the more holistic picture of what is it that's led you to be so successful in so many different settings. Because I think we both know some coanglers that really are if not dominant, do very well on particular types of water. And there are also guys at the pointy end of the boat, like you are now, sometimes are great on certain bodies of water or types of fisheries, but are not necessarily so great on other types of fisheries. So it's really cool to see you do so well in so many places. How about if we start then with the Delta, since you live there? You mentioned that was your first win. You've got a couple of titles in FLW from there, and then it sounds like one Bassmaster earlier than that. So could you talk about those wins a little bit? And I may have some follow-up questions.
Sure. Gosh, let's go to the most recent.
Okay. Yeah.
And
that was September 2019. Is that right? I think that's
that
right.
was, September 2019. Yeah, exactly. So for that event, it was crazy. There was a lot of things going on. There was pre-spawn, spawn, and some post-spawn going on. And I got to get out on the water at the time and practice a little bit. And I knew there was some top water bites going on, and I knew there was a great flip bite going on. And I also was able to finesse a few fish. And usually when I attack any of those lakes, especially on the Delta, I always try to put myself in fishing as a co-angler in all kinds of situations. So when I practice for places like that, if I was practicing with a pro, I would let him fish the way he wanted to fish, and then try to see how I can put opportunities from the back of the boat, depending how his style of fishing was going to be.
Mm-hmm.
And I would actually, for that specific event, I would tell the pro to put me in awkward positions.
Yeah.
If it was, say, a rock wall and that kind of thing. And then I would figure out how to catch him beside that. So I always kept my head on a swivel. Once I figured out how to catch them, say, for instance, on riprap versus toolies. And I would say, okay, how can the pro put me in a bad position, and how can I adjust from there? Was very important for me.
Yeah, let me dive into that a little bit. And as with anything, I my sense is you're at the front of the boat now, so you don't care as much about talking baseball, but be as candid as you like, or not candid. It's totally fine. But let's just take one of those kind of classic situations at the Delta. High tide, for those out there, there's a lot of riprap levees at the Delta, and there's vegetation that grows, several feet from the riprap. Tide goes up and down, and there's a trough, which by the time this is out, people will have heard from Dave Zavar's podcast a little bit about the trough as well. And so the trough is at high tide is where a lot of the fish tend to hang out. It's pretty common for guys at the front of the boat to run the trough along a riprap, perhaps power fishing, sometimes, throwing a Senko or something, but oftentimes moving pretty quickly. So can you take people through how you think about a situation like that? Because there's a few things you can do, but it's pretty challenging at the back of the boat.
Yeah, it is. I had, you just remind me of a situation I fished where the guy was practically hitting his motor or the side of the boat on the rocks.
Yeah.
And in that situation, there's always fish on what I call the old shoreline, where the water is going to drop, no matter what.
You mean where the water will be at low tide?
Yes.
Yeah.
So there's always fish going to be there, and those are the fish that kind of move up to the shallows, to the trough, and then as the trough drops, then they move back up into that cover. There might not be as many bites, and I could see a lot of co-anglers get discouraged because the pros catching so many fish. But I've also caught really big fish just casting, or whether it's a finesse technique like a drop shot, or if I was just covered with grass, I would just pick up a punch rod and then just use the tool that can put me in position to get a bite.
Yeah. And so let's say you've got I don't know, let's say 5 to 10 feet wide vegetation, so you've got the levee on one side, you got the vegetation on the other. And let's say it's not clumpy, but it's the scenario you're describing where you got the punch rod. When you're talking about trying to aim for where the low tide line is and fishing over in that direction, are you fishing just generally throughout that grass, or are you like aiming for the outside weed edge, or
Uh,
all of the above?
well, if I had practiced for it,
Yeah.
I would
Yeah.
test the whole entire thing, either the outside edge, the inside edge, or in the middle.
Yeah.
Sometimes
Got
they'll
it.
be actually tucked in the middle of all the grass,
Yeah.
depending on, say, if you're going to use a reaction there, if you have enough water. Like if he was on high tide, there was still a water above that carpet,
Mm-hmm.
I
Mm-hmm.
call it,
Yeah.
grass.
Yeah.
Um, I'm going to figure out something and practice to throw over that to get bit if he was going to do that.
Yeah. Got
Or
it.
I would, for instance, if I can't see the grass because of dirty water,
Mm-hmm.
and I would find a tool. Most of the time would be a flip bait where I can flip as far as I can, or say chatterbait as far as I can until I hit that grass
Yeah.
and get feed in on the area. Like how
Yeah.
far out does the grass go? Some of them are long flats
Yep.
or smaller flats, and just use that as kind of like a measuring tool while I'm casting. First thing, and if he happens to end up staying there, then I feel comfortable of the area, and now I'd pick up my flip bait and make precise casts where I had got bit on a reaction.
Yeah.
So
Got
it's
it.
always a puzzle. It's always like a kind of like a learning new water type deal because you did not practice there most of the time.
Yep.
Yeah.
Yep. Yeah. Especially on a place that's as big as the Delta, but sometimes you get lucky. So in that scenario, some people, I know some co-anglers who will occasionally make super long casts behind the boat. Occasionally they'll drag something like a Senko way back there. Sounds like most of the time your approach though is to fish relatively, if you're tight to the riprap, fish perpendicular to the boat more or less in
Yeah. If I'm right
the
on the
yeah.
rocks, I would fish. Exactly. I would fish out. Depending on if that trough is deep,
Yeah.
I always look at the back of the motor. If it's throwing up mud, I'm not going to cast back there.
Yeah.
But if
Yep.
it's not throwing up mud and it's deep, then I can uh, drag a wacky Senko in the back,
Yeah.
and you can get bit that way. Um,
Yeah.
and
And
I'll
that's like
try that
way back that you do it, or
way
yeah.
back. It's amazing. Uh, some of the biggest bass I've caught was when people are kind of riding the bank, but they give you like 5 feet from the boat to the rocks,
Mm-hmm.
or let's say 10 feet.
Yeah.
Um, and they're just kind of doing like a 45 cast or maybe
Yeah.
a parallel cast. I've pitched my crankbaits right to the rocks and reeled it in, and I've caught 7-pounders that way.
And in that case, is it sort of 45-degree angle backwards, or do you mean
I'm
forwards,
doing
or
perpendicular, straight
perpendicular?
to the bank.
Okay, so it's like a 10 foot at most pitch.
Yeah, I
Yeah.
would just do a different angle than he was doing, and I think a lot of times they might see his bait go by, and then they miss the opportunity, and then I would throw, and a lot of my bites would be within like there's only 2 feet out of my rod tip,
Yeah.
where I've caught a 7-pounder one time in a Bassmasters,
That's amazing. Yeah.
and then several 5-pounders in the past,
Yeah.
something like that.
Yeah. Yeah. I've caught some fish from the back of the boat there, like practically right at my feet in that scenario, but turned around the other way. So just flipping to the grass, that edge that's right under you. And I used to always think that, as the boat goes by, those fish are going to, take off. There's not going to be anything there. But I think sometimes they're just so dug into the grass. If you find the right fish and you drop it right on their head, they may react and eat it sometimes.
Yeah, no, exactly. And it could be a different zone. A lot of times in events, there'll be a zone where some of the big fish focus on, which is maybe a foot below the surface,
Mm-hmm.
um, maybe 4 feet below the surface, maybe closer to the bottom. That's another thing I look for when I practice
Okay.
is where am I going to get a big bite? And I kind of check the upper zone, which is top water, and then below the upper zone, then the mid zone, and then the bottom.
Yeah.
So once I kind of figure that out, then I start grabbing the right divers, per se, or chatterbait, um, whether it's a 3/8 or a half ounce, depending on what I'm going to do and what zone I'm trying to target.
Yeah.
And sometimes I could throw, if I knew there was two zones going and then the pros covering the upper zone, then I can maybe throw the same chatterbait, but I'm throwing a 3/4 ounce chatterbait instead of his 3/8 ounce
Mm-hmm.
chatterbait,
Mm-hmm.
and then target a whole different fish.
Yeah. That's super interesting. On one of the podcasts we did recently, with Noah Dicknight, who's in the Ozarks, he talked about fishing docks at places like Lake of the Ozarks. And one of the points he kept making repeatedly was if you're fishing the same dock and your pro is fishing something on the bottom, swimming something in along the
Side.
top upper edge,
Yeah.
or even if you're able to skip it under, when you get there, swim something along the top because it's a completely different set of fish, and vice versa. If your pro's fishing something up high that they're skipping, you want to aim low, and it's kind of the same point you're making. There are different water columns that you can exploit and look for different fish than your pro.
Exactly. Yeah. One of the big ones, I mean, especially like if you finesse fish,
Mm-hmm.
which you definitely need to learn on the coangler side,
For sure.
uh, is, for instance, if it was a drop shot or a shaky head and you're targeting fish on the bottom or near the bottom, don't be afraid to also work it after you're done with the bottom. So I can swim it up,
Mm-hmm.
shake it back, and they will eat that just like a swim jig. So also
Interesting.
pay attention to stuff like that. I'm sure people have said this before where they go, "Oh my gosh, it chased it all the way to the boat." Well,
Yep.
those fish are very catchable if you actually work that technique off the bottom and back to
Mm-hmm.
the boat.
Yeah.
So that's another opportunity that a lot of people miss.
Yeah. Super interesting. So, with respect to the Delta, and really across all of your events, but when I've seen discussions published about your winning techniques, one thing I'm struck by is you always have mentioned typically a lot of variety. I get the sense from that the so-called junk fisherman, Jack Farage is probably doing a lot of different things over the course of 3 days in most events. And I guess what I'm wondering is a couple things for the Delta. If you had to put baits in different buckets, so let's say top water, reaction stuff that's subsurface, and then finesse like drop shot or shaky head, basically, typically, probably more often drop shot on the Delta, and then punching. What fraction of your fish over time in tournaments at the Delta have come on those four different things? So top water, moving subsurface, finesse, and then punching.
I'd probably say finesse is probably number one,
Yeah.
because a lot of times the fish shut down throughout the day,
Yep.
and um, you have to be realistic with yourself. If you're not getting bit, well, you shouldn't be throwing, something that's not getting bit. So,
Yeah.
um, especially on the co-angler side.
Yep.
Uh, but
Does that mean like 90% of your weighed fish have been on finesse, or 50%,
it's
or?
probably safe. I would probably say 60%
Okay.
of the fish.
Yeah.
You're not going to always win on like finesse fishing. There could be some tournaments
Yep.
where you might win on finesse, but there's always going to be opportunities. For instance, I would be throwing a drop shot and all of a sudden something looks really good for a frog.
Yeah.
And I would make that, I would stop, drop the rod, grab the frog, and make a few casts. And a lot of times you might get rewarded with something really big, which you're always like trying to fish what's in front of you,
Yep.
per se. So keep all your options open and uh, don't just die on one technique.
Yeah.
There've been tournaments what I've won, like in the Bassmasters at Clear Lake, I won on a half-ounce Bill Lewis rattle trap. I fished that all 3 days. It never left my hand. And
Wow.
there'll be tournaments where you have to keep switching because it's fish are different in different stages, doing different things in different spots.
Yeah. And the guy in front of you is doing something different each day sometimes
Yes, and
as well.
that's actually another. You should use that as another rod, a measuring rod for yourself. So I'm always paying attention of what the pro's doing and what technique he's throwing and what zone he's covering.
Mm-hmm.
And I'm always keeping that in mind, and then watching how many bites he gets, what size the fish are. And another thing I look for is, let's say if I was fishing finesse techniques, is how good the fish ate that bait. Like if I'm getting
Yeah.
them like right on the lip,
Yeah.
I'm either my presentation's a little bit off because my goal is to be right in the throat.
Yeah. Yep.
And that's the kind of adjustments you need to make from day to day,
Mm-hmm.
which is also very important.
Yeah.
So you shouldn't be just throwing a certain bait, a certain presentation the same way every day. Don't just say, oh, they're not eating the drop shot anymore. They're going to eat the drop shot every day.
Yeah.
It's just a matter if you figure out how to get them to bite it, whether it's going to be a faster shake on your rod tip, a slower shake, a drag now instead of
Yeah.
all that stuff needs to be practiced before these events when you go fun fishing.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
So always pay attention to each technique. I've won a frog tournament on the snag proof in 2008. I've top fived in 5 of them. I actually put the frog in my hand. I had the frog on deck in the backyard all year, the year before.
Yeah.
And I got really good at it. So
Yeah.
whatever weakness you have, make sure you put that in on your deck every day of that year to get better at it.
Yeah. Yeah. And potentially go fishing with only one rod to force yourself.
I mean, don't just go one rod because you still want to catch fish for the day, but at least
I don't mean in a tournament, but I mean like if you're fun fishing. Because honestly, that's how I taught myself how to punch. Because I would, I'd put that rod down because I was like bored with it, but sometimes you have to do that.
Yeah, definitely. I mean, it doesn't take. I mean, if you put a punch rod in your hand for, let's just say there's a good punch bite.
Yeah.
And you're not very good at it.
Yeah.
I recommend you do that every day for as many times as you can.
Yep.
Until you get really comfortable with it.
Yep.
And then once you get comfortable with it, you're comfortable to reach for it in situations where, say, for instance, as a coangler, there happens to be one mat.
Yeah.
But the pro didn't even target it, and it was just sitting there by itself. And then you just happen to pick up the punch rod, and then you make that flip, and you catch that 8-pounder.
Yep.
So that is so important. So don't be one dimensional. Make sure you learn finesse, and then make sure you also learn how to power fish.
Yeah, for sure. So, on the podcast with Dave, I think I brought up that I can think of several situations where I was having a conversation with somebody, in all cases from the Pacific Northwest, I think, they were coming down to fish the Delta from the back of the boat. And everybody reads all about the punch bite. And I think oftentimes they think that if you haven't fished a tournament at the Delta before, all you're going to be doing is punching all day long. And of course, we know that, as you mentioned, a fraction of the time when there's something that's appropriate to punch, that's within a cast length and a pitch length.
Yes.
And most of the time, those things are going to be beaten up by the guy in the front of the boat before you even get an opportunity. So it is really more of, as you're saying, more of a selective thing, and things like drop shot are really the bread and butter. And then it sounds like you weave everything else in when you get the opportunity over the course of the day.
Yeah. Well, as far as the punch bite goes, I've won a tournament on the Delta. That was an FLW, and I pretty much punched the whole entire tournament.
Wow.
And I punched behind punchers.
Okay.
So the biggest key in punching behind somebody is kind of try to figure out either a different weight. One time that happened. If he's using an ounce and a half, I might try a 1 ounce.
Yeah, and see
And
if
then
they like a slower rate of fall.
yeah, and he's going deep into the stuff where I would target the edge of the stuff where it could not even go into the mat. It could be falling on the side of it.
Yeah.
In open water.
Yeah.
So you always kind of want to like play around with the rate of fall compared to the pro that's fishing in front of you. And then another thing is retrieves. Is very important. Like he could be kind of finessing it through that grass, and then I've had a technique where I throw it in there and I would stroke the rod. I'd snap it.
Yeah.
And get bit that way.
Yeah.
Where those fish will not bite what he's doing. So I kind of pay attention to how he's presenting the bait and how he's catching it. And a lot of times you'll find that there'll be two ways to catch them in that mat. And as you get good at it, you'll remember if you're doing a certain presentation in the mat, there's also this other presentation that's happening at the same time. And I've had that happen throughout the years, same time again. So just by getting a glimpse of those things in a short practice before an event, I can kind of feel what the fish are doing and put that together on the days of the events. Even though I might not have done that presentation, I knew this other presentation was working. So this should also work too.
Yeah.
Just over the years, you kind of put together side by side different presentations.
Yeah.
Doing the same exact bait.
Yeah, that's awesome. So for moving baits from the back deck and subsurface stuff, I imagine like most people at the Delta, you've probably weighed some fish on chatterbaits and square bills over the years. Do you tend to fish one of those more than the other? Obviously, there's slightly different tools that have some advantages in different places on the Delta. But do you put both of those to play quite a bit?
I do. I kind of feel out how the grass kind of looks.
Yeah.
And if it's got a lot of slime everywhere you go, then I'm not going to pick up something with a treble hook.
Yep.
So I would just prefer doing a chatterbait instead. Or I would, I've done like a square bill with 20-pound test and fished it up high in the water column over the grass. So I do not get clogged.
Yeah.
And they've come out and ate that. So you kind of have to play around with your line based on what kind of grass is growing for that particular period.
Yeah.
So that's also important. Making sure you. Sometimes I'll use mono for chatterbaits. Sometimes I'll use braid. Sometimes I'll use fluoro. It just depends of which line is going to get me through the grass better, and I could be more efficient.
Yeah.
Always look at that.
Yeah. And also you mentioned, obviously on the Delta at different tides, the way you fish a chatterbait and the way it comes through is different. You mentioned earlier using different weight chatterbaits. And then of course you can use different trailers that, like the line, impact where the chatterbait is coming through the water column. So I think probably a big takeaway here is to think about the different water columns, what the pro's fishing, make sure to experiment, and ideally figure it out and practice ahead of time to give yourself some options.
Yes. And don't always think you have to make a long cast. A lot of coanglers kind of want to beat the pro out to the front.
Yeah.
So a lot of times it's just little small targets because you're put in tight situations where it's very hard to make a good, decent cast. And it's okay to make a 6-7 foot cast. And I've caught some of the biggest fish that way. So just look at it as just a tool, and don't look at it as like you're being hindered by the pro. Put yourself. I've always told this to myself, and early in my fishing career, is everybody is in the same boat. So throughout the event, one of the guys an M is going to draw is going to put him in that bad situation. So eventually, after hopefully you make the third day cut,
Yeah.
I've came back from like 45th place to taking second one time, lost by 4 ounces. So there's always opportunities to catch them, even though like you don't have enough water to be fishing. So I never complained. I've always looked at it as a fun puzzle to solve.
Yep. That's one of the things that makes
That's what
coangling
makes
so
it
much fun.
way funner, or else it makes it for a long, boring,
Yeah.
you just want to quit type day. And I've seen guys do that. And, I try to help I've helped a lot of AMs actually make the top 10 after they've been discouraged and to the point where they didn't even want to fish another AM event.
Oh, man.
And then they realize like, oh, okay. So if I look for these small opportunities, that's good enough.
Yeah.
And you're not trying to, I always say you're trying to beat your pro in the front, but not by like cutting him off
Of course. Yeah.
He's the first measure of what's going on the water. So if I'm able to put more fish and get more bites than the guy in the front of the boat, I'm doing the right thing. And if I'm not, then I'm still playing around with my tackle. And sometimes that doesn't happen because of the certain situation where he's getting best shots at everything. But I'm always trying to figure out that one technique behind the boat that can get me more bites than he's.
Yeah.
That's another one.
Yeah. So I think people have probably gotten a pretty good sense of what some of your decision making is like on the water, on the Delta. I have maybe one more question about the Delta, and then I want to be mindful of time and make sure we cover some other places. Honestly, I could talk to you for days and days about the Delta.
Yeah.
And it just keep going. But so my last question on the Delta is top water wise. Obviously, there are a lot of options. You mentioned frogs, major player there. I know you've caught some important fish in the past on a whopper plopper. Poppers certainly can play a role on the Delta. Walking baits. Of these, do you put all of them to play in your? Yeah. Okay.
Yeah, I do. It's really based on the mood of the fish. So
and a buzz bait. Sorry, I forgot a
right now
key player. Yeah,
there's some post spawn going on now. So now you're missing out if you're not throwing top water.
Yep.
So the first thing I do is say, for instance, there's an event coming up. If there's an event coming up right now, I would have a popper. I would have a whopper plopper. I would have a frog. I would have what other technique you can have?
Walking bait. I don't fish those as much there now, but
is really good. A fluke is really good. That kind of shows you like what mood they're in. So you could throw that over around mats or little pockets, but you definitely want to test different types of topwater before an event. And sometimes certain topwater go with other topwaters. For instance, if there's a popper bite, I know there's going to be a whopper plopper bite. So you have to kind of figure out what the presentation is on the popper, and then you have to figure out what the presentation is going to be on the whopper plopper. And sometimes you don't need to figure that out. If you just figure out one of them based on experience from the past, how to do the whopper plopper versus the popper. But sometimes they they're not going to go chasing, and you need to go right over their head. And that's when the slower topwater happens, where I might lean more towards like a frog and a popper.
If it's grass is clean enough.
Yes.
Yeah.
And then for sure, if the whopper plopper bite's going, I'd rather throw that than any of those, because that's going to cover more water. So you kind of have to be smart about what the mood of the fish is.
Yeah. And do you like full size whopper plopper? Like
I do really small, tiny ones to the normal size. I mean, I've caught them on the big giant ones.
Yeah.
But I've never done that as a coangler. I've never
kind of requires bringing a separate rod.
You have to have a
So
separate
it's not
rod,
so
yeah,
convenient. Yeah.
and be exactly, and then be positioned where there's giant fish in that area. Um, but now I'm
And
able to do that on the pro side.
yeah, there you go.
Yeah,
So, and I would imagine maybe just one follow up question on that. I sort of know the answer to this, but wind, I suspect, can impact when they're on a pattern where you could catch them 2 or 3 different ways on top. You probably might be more likely to start fishing a particular bait depending on how hard it's blowing. So, for instance, a popper sometimes adjacent to a target in a setting where there's not much wind can be a good choice. But if it's blowing like crazy out there, not necessarily the
yeah.
best choice.
Well, no, I mean it could be the best choice. The
Okay.
the tournament I've won, I won that frog tournament on the Delta. Was super windy, and I fished very calm banks,
Okay.
close to like rollers.
Yeah. Yeah.
So there's always
It's
opportunities
a little microclimate.
for calm
Yeah.
spots,
Yeah.
on that. So it just based on the mood of the fish. A lot of times, if it's windy, it doesn't mean they're going to hit something faster. It's just what the fish will tell you what they want, and if they are liking something in their face longer, I'm gonna try to throw that in like calmer. Say, for instance, 5 foot little table size a spot.
Yeah.
Uh,
Yeah.
so that's important. But I'll always like if the wind comes up in midday, I'll always like let me check on the buzzbait bite or
Yeah.
or however I know how to catch them based on
Mm-hmm.
certain chop or I'll pick up that tool and kind of experiment, even though I might have not done it in practice because there was no wind.
Yeah.
Um, because that they could change in a minute.
Yeah. All right. All right. I can't help it. Last Delta question. And then
Yeah,
maybe I can talk to you some other time. I'll
yeah.
pick your brain. But
Oh,
small wake bait or small glide ever play a role for you in a tournament setting?
yeah, yeah. I have utilized little small S waivers
Yeah.
to regular size S
The
wave.
168. Yeah.
Yeah, um, many times
Yeah.
in events, and
At,
it's not
at the Delta though. Um,
on the Delta.
yeah. Okay.
Yep, right over grass is a good opportunity. Again, if it's nice, clean, sharp grass where
Yeah.
there's no,
With a window above it. Yeah.
I'll play around with that for sure,
Yeah.
and you can catch some big ones doing that. But before I pull out stuff like that, they should be eating a fluke. So once I test the water with plastic type, top water, before I pull out treble hooks, I want to make sure that they're actually targeting that zone.
Okay.
And then once you see them coming up to something like a fluke, um, there's always going to be a
Yeah.
glide bait bite.
Yeah. Cool.
Yeah,
I love the S Waver 168. It's like one of my favorite things to fish. So
yeah.
that's
Oh no,
fun.
it's amazing. Actually,
Yeah.
one co-angler won an event, a championship, uh,
Yeah.
which I thought was amazing. I think he did that on all 3 days of the event,
Wow.
and he basically fished bluff walls.
Yeah.
I forgot them. Was it Table Rock? No, it wasn't Table Rock. It was another event. And then the pro that won the whole entire event was throwing a little tailspin.
Hmm. Yeah.
So that just
Interesting.
tells you, like, there's so many
You can
different
catch them a
ways
bunch of different ways.
to catch them. But you would think the pros doing the glide
Right. The opposite. Yep.
it was the opposite. So always use it as a tool. And once you get good at it, like for instance, you love the S
Yeah.
waiver, you should always try to introduce that on every body water you go to, and just to make sure that it's not happening. And if it is, then you're gonna feel that more confident
Yeah.
in
Yeah.
throwing.
I fish it, I would say occasionally in tournaments. It's definitely not with me every time.
Yeah.
But when I do, it's one of those things like you were describing earlier, having the frog accessible. So when you go by something that looks froggy, you make a few casts with it, in a kind of high potential area.
Yes.
But yeah, so thanks. This is great, Jack. Super good wisdom on the Delta. I think we should probably leave it there on the Delta for time. How about if we go to Havasu?
Yeah.
It is a amazing fishery, very unique, lots of different things you can do there. And I have some experience there, but it's relatively limited compared to yours. But I think it's one of the things that's so remarkable about that place is oftentimes you're doing completely different things all 3 days, depending on whether, you're fishing shallow upriver, fishing smallmouth, you can flip, you can catch them on moving baits. Many times of the year, you can do a lot of different things. But I think when you won there, it was an early March tournament and you won by an ounce over Ty Faber. And the weights were pretty high compared to a lot of those early spring tournaments there.
Yeah.
It can be pretty tough there sometimes.
Super tough. I've been there where you practice for 2 days and maybe had one bite.
Yeah.
So in January, February timeframe, and once you hit March and April, it just turns into a whole different fishery.
Yeah. Yeah.
And it's much better for the coangler for sure.
Yeah, for sure. Yeah.
Yep.
No doubt. So maybe could you tell us a little bit about how the high level going from day one through day three and that tournament that you won, how did you pull that off? I think you mentioned a lot of different baits in the write up for that one.
Yeah. So for that event, day one, I had a pro that bed fished.
Mm-hmm.
And I was able to, he actually bed fished and he cage fished.
Yeah.
And I was able to catch him on a drop shot and a split shot.
Yeah.
Pretty good with him. And basically, I used the split shot when we went out to the cages, and I also threw the drop shot there. And I threw the drop shot, fan casted the drop shot, and swim baits while he was bed fishing for a certain fish.
And those were, I think per the write up, it was like Kitex, like 3.3 and 3.8, or I think you may have said in the write up. For both the drop shot and the split shot rig, are you using finesse worms, a worm or something? Okay.
For the split shot, I used a tiny brush hog.
Okay. Yeah.
And that was good. And then I also used just a regular robo.
Yeah.
I kind of played around with curly tail and then a straight tail.
Got it.
And then I got bit on both, and ended up giving me some pretty good fish doing that. And then caught several drop shotting, and I think I caught one on a 3.3.
Yeah.
Because I mixed a lot of different size swim baits in that event, because day two I ended up in dirty water fishing with another guy that actually was an am one time on Clear Lake, and Justin something, he beat me on Clear Lake in an FLW as a co-angler, and now I draw him as a pro. He's the pro and I'm the co, and I ended up doing some major damage in the back of the boat on him, and that was a lot of drop shotting and throwing a 4.8.
Okay.
Kite. Yeah. And he was fishing dirty water actually, and in the morning he's throwing a spinner bait where he was covering water pretty fast. And, I was able to put a 4.8 Kitech in that same water, and he never caught one on a spinner bait, and he had 17 pounds on day one doing the spinner bait. So it was crazy how they ate my spinner bait or my swim bait better than his spinner bait. And then he proceeded to go offshore and try throwing some swim baits. And I caught some really good ones drop shotting.
Cool.
Yeah. And then the last day was
go ahead.
The last day was incredible. It was one of those where it was such a high to a low and back to a high, because I came in there with pretty good weight, feeling good. And I started fishing, and I remember putting some decent fish, catching them different ways, chatterbait, crankbait. I did a wiggle wart,
Mm-hmm.
and then I did uh, caught several drop shotting. And I remember we got to this one point where the pro was like, "Okay, I'm gonna bedfish." And then we went into bedfish, and he was kind of casting around, and I was casting. I think one of the biggest things that helped me in that event is throughout the tournament I was throwing 6-pound tests on my drop shot. That helped me with a lot more bites than a lot of co-anglers. But I happened to throw my 6-pound test into the toolies, and I get the biggest bite of like my practice end, and I hooked this thing, and it took me in the toolies and snapped me off.
Oh,
And the pro was like, "Okay, we have uh, 10 minutes, I think at the time, 10 minutes left." So I go down and re-rig and beef up my line, and I put on the drop shot and throw it back in. Um, and I remember the point where he said, "We have 5 minutes left."
mm-hmm.
And then I catch a 5-pounder, and then I land it, and he's like, "We got to go." And that was pretty much the winning fish.
That
So I
is,
had the opportunity twice, messed up the first time, and I got lucky with another opportunity.
yeah.
And that was fishing inside the toolies, but don't ever throw 6-pound tests in toolies.
Yeah. That, because of the diversity of the places you may end up at Havasu, I always, when I'm thinking about which rods I'm going to have in the boat there for a tournament that time of year, sometimes because I really like to fish the Bubba shot or power shot,
Yeah.
around the toolies,
Yeah.
but I also want to fish the super finesse drop shot. If you're offshore or in other parts of that lake, it's always a struggle for me to figure out whether I'm going to bring 2 drop shot rods and I bring both of those, or, I just bring one. I'm curious about the fishing around the cages approach you mentioned. And maybe for some of the people watching in other parts of the country who may not know Havasu that well, when Jack refers to fishing cages, those are basically just man-made structures, PVC or something, that are like little fish condominiums that attract bait fish, and some of the bigger bass like to hang out in those. If you know where they are, if you got forward facing sonar, you're at the front of the boat, you can actually cast to them and purposely bounce stuff off of them. But from the back of the boat, you're often kind of fishing blind, unless you're in a place where the water's super clear and you're fishing stuff close to you that you can see. I think it's tough as a coangler because you often need lighter line to get bit. But when you're fishing around the cages, you're going to end up donating a lot of tackle. So I'm wondering, with the split shot rig, what pound test did you fish with that, and how do you think about that dilemma on your end?
I usually just do 12 main. I'll have a braided line, and
Yeah.
I'll put a 12-pound leader,
Okay.
and then your swivel and weight go there. Or if you're going to crimp on a weight, and then if I was using a swivel, then I would put a 10-pound test final leader.
Okay. So you've got the 12 there to a swivel, so you won't have to retie that much. Your 10 will break first if it's going to break, and then you
Exactly.
can re-rig quickly.
Yep.
Okay.
Exactly. I'm not rigging the whole entire thing. Um, I'm always whenever I'm like when I fished as a co-angler and I didn't see the cages, I would start with my swim baits and
Mm-hmm.
kind of feel it out. And then
Yeah.
I've always had either an open hook if I wasn't fishing around cages, and I'd also have a belly weighted
Yeah.
uh, Kitech,
Yeah.
and basically throw that around unless I see the pro casting at a certain direction for a while, and kind of study where he's casting. And if he's talking about a cage, I'm keeping that in mind. until he moves on to the next cage. Because wherever there's a cage, there's always more
Yeah.
cages that he's going to go to next. So if the water's not clear and you don't see it, then I'll start working the Carolina rig or
Mm-hmm.
the split shot
Yeah.
around those cages.
Yeah.
And sometimes you will break off, and sometimes you get lucky and come out of there. But if you actually figure out where you don't want to be behind the cage, because if you're bringing it up into the cage, something bad's going to happen. I'd rather throw it on the side of the cage. I don't necessarily need to hit the cage.
Mm-hmm.
They'll come out and get it, either the corners of the cage, or I'll target that with a drop shot. And especially if I could see it, then I start casting on the shady part of the cage,
Mm-hmm.
depending on where the sun is.
Yeah.
So I'll cast that where the corner, and I'll never make a dumb cast over the cage.
Okay.
I'll just keep myself away from that, even though what if I get bit and I get lucky? I mean, if I'm desperate, I might do it.
Yeah. Yeah.
But be smart about where you cast it. And I like to cast it away from the cage and bring it into the cage,
Mm-hmm.
because as soon as you start feeling it, now you're kind of cautious, where you can kind of leave it there instead of start running into the cage.
Yeah. Yeah. Okay.
Yeah.
And for the small swim baits like the 3.3 Kitech, given that same dilemma where sometimes at Havasu you need to fish lighter line sometimes to get the most bites, but there are some places where you might put it where, around cages, it can be a challenge. So if you are fishing, either whether it's belly weighted or not, what do you like line wise at Havasu?
For Havasu, I've done 6-pound test
Yeah.
to braid.
Okay. Including with the belly weighted?
And the belly weighted,
Yeah.
I always go either 12 or more, 15.
Okay. So you might carry 2 rods as a coangler with Kitechs?
Yes, or
Okay.
have leaders.
Yeah.
With
Got
braid
it.
to
Yeah.
leader. Another thing that helps me out in a lot of those events is I always put a clip,
Yeah.
and
So you can change quickly.
and I can clip on like different crankbaits, jerk baits, and that's important. There'll be one rod allocated with a clip.
Yeah. Yeah. Cool.
Kind of feel it out. But Havasu was amazing. It was actually the pro's first time winning a major event, so I was stoked for him too. So
That's awesome.
yeah.
Let's talk a little bit about Shasta. So here on the West Coast, on most tournament trails, there's a January Shasta visit. It's certainly it's a very different fishery than everything we've talked about so far. You're primarily focused on spotted bass, although largies are starting to play a little bit bigger role there last year or so, but mostly from the front of the boat. Maybe you can take us through how you think about prepping for Shasta, how your win there went, and any things that you feel are important for co-anglers thinking about doing well at Shasta in your typical January tournament.
Shasta, you definitely need to have. I always bring like a spider grub on a football head.
Mm-hmm.
That would be as far as I go with a jig.
Yeah.
It's super easy to make a long cast. I've also done, for that particular event, I've used 1 ounce football jigs with a spider grub.
Yeah. And is that because you can cast farther and they get down quicker, or is it because you're using them in 80 feet of water?
Both, depending on how the fish are set up. Sometimes I'll make a long cast, and I call it kind of four-wheeling,
Mm-hmm.
where I'm bouncing the jig all the way back to the boat.
Yeah.
And covering as much water as I can with it to get
Mm-hmm.
bit.
Mm-hmm.
So there's that technique that I do. And then there's also a technique where I kind of call it deep water punching. So I'm basically making a pitch right to the side of the boat on top of whatever it is, a structure that we're fishing, based on what the pro's doing. Like if he's kind of targeting just deep with a drop shot or something, I will pick up a jig that's, a 1 ounce, and drop it and start popping it around, see if I can get a big bite. I've done that like in championships, and um, I got rewarded some pretty big fish doing stuff
Interesting.
like
Yeah.
that. And then
So the punching name for that technique, though, is mostly because you think of it that way because you're using the larger weight and it's a short pitch, more or
it's a
less.
short bit. Exactly.
Okay.
Yep. It almost looks like, if somebody's videotaping you, you're kind of punching.
Yeah.
Same thing.
Yeah. Interesting.
And yeah, those are also some pretty good opportunities where,
Yeah.
if, say, for instance, he's throwing finesse and he's catching a certain size, that bigger one might want a reaction of a jig getting snapped off the bottom.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
So that helped me in that event with a couple of good fish. And I remember, I don't know if it was that one or the Oroville tournament. I think it might have been the Oroville tournament, but I also use, a lot of people use Ned rigs.
Mm-hmm.
I don't use Ned rigs as much. Always use a tube,
Okay.
a finesse tube.
Yeah.
And I use really small hooks on that, so I don't get snagged up. But
so external hooks, but they're tiny, so they're less likely to snag.
Yes.
Okay.
Yeah. And also, I'll also rig it. You probably heard the term "stupid tube," where you're rigging it and it's kind of like weedless.
Yeah.
I'll also do that in certain situations. If I'm kind of letting it sit longer in places where you're definitely going to get snagged with an exposed hook. So that technique was huge in that event. And then as far as worms go, I've always used a trick worm.
Yeah.
For shaky heads.
Yeah.
On those bodies of water.
And I noticed you mentioned in one of the write-ups for Shasta that color is something that, at least at the time, you felt was important. And I think it seemed like it was in the context of tournaments that type of year, depending on where you are and what's been going on weather-wise, you can have a little more stained water. Some guys get a little creative with color and change a lot depending on where they are and subtle differences. But for you, does that make a big difference, or how do you think about color there?
Actually, I've always done like whether it's a worm or a tube. I'll do different colors, as far as like one translucent, one would be more of like a bait fish color, translucent.
Yeah.
See if I get bit better on that compared to, let's say, I have another color that's really dark brown. And then another key thing is when let's say you hook into some grass or something down there, and you pull it up, and it's, say for instance, it's like a very light green. I have another color called Old Ugly.
Yeah.
That kind of matches that.
Yeah.
So a lot of times,
is that a Dry Creek tube? Or I know, at least in that, the Dry Creek brand tubes.
Dry Creek. Yeah. I always look at the bottom when you pull up the stuff off the bottom. There's always going to be like something close to it.
Yeah.
And if I have like a worm close to that or a tube, I'll make sure I try that.
Okay. And is that because you're anticipating that forage in the vicinity of the bottom, like crayfish, are going to be dark, similar colored?
Yep.
Yeah.
Yes. The crawfish could be that color, or let's say I'm targeting like both crawfish and maybe the bait fish. They could eat both, but maybe the crawfish, especially at Shasta and Oroville, will give you a few more ounces than let's say a bait fish color. It's weird.
Yeah. Yeah.
Like, because that game is won by ounces. You
Yeah.
could catch 2.5 pounders, let's say, on something dark, and then you'll only catch 1.7s on something that color.
Yeah.
You know what I
Yeah.
mean?
That's
So
interesting. Yeah, totally.
they do focus certain times depending on, like, if they need the crayfish to help them with the spawn,
Hmm.
or the bait fish. And a lot of times too, you could feel the teeth.
Yeah.
If you keep catching them and the teeth are worn out,
Hmm.
then there's a lot of crawfish
Crawfish.
happening. And then
Yeah.
it's super sharp, and you're like, oh my gosh, your arm's getting tore up, and that's a lot of bait fish
Yeah. Yeah.
type colors.
Yeah.
And the same thing with the worms. I'll play around with that. If it's super clear water, I kind of like stay away from flake,
Hmm.
even though it's translucent. I'll try to stay away from flake in the color of the worm, whether it's going to be a margarita, uh, uh, or a margarita 3, a
Hmm.
mutilator 3. They're
Yeah.
both totally different.
Yeah. The
So
3 being more flake or
the
a
3
little
has
bit of
got flake,
flash.
and then
Yeah.
the other one has no flake.
Yeah.
Yep.
Yep.
So there's always, like, sampling that kind of stuff in practice will help you, like, develop something for the event. But you should have both in the tournament,
Yeah.
because weather comes and all of a sudden your clear water turned into dirtier water,
Yeah.
and you're able to make a little adjustment.
Yeah. So I'm really struck by in particular from what you just said, the amount of movement on either your spider grub or the tube. Um I certainly, when I've fished there in the winter, oftentimes put a little bit of effort into varying retrieves, but the feels like the last couple years, this year it seemed like there were a lot of jigfish in comparison to past years, and at least where we were fishing. But most of the time it seemed like they didn't want it moved that quickly. But I didn't do great in the tournament, but a couple of the slightly bigger fish that I caught were when, I was fishing a 3/4 ounce jig and it got hung and I popped it out of there and the fish ate it. So I started playing around a little bit more after that. And it seems like from what you're saying, you feel like if you're around a certain size class of fish, the fish that are in that vicinity that are on the slightly larger size may be a little bit more likely to chase something that's moving a little bit more.
Yeah.
Uh,
Or they're in an off mood until they see that.
yeah. Okay.
You're kind of putting them in a position where they have to bite it.
Yeah.
So yeah, always kind of check, like, sometimes I'll drag it on the bottom. Sometimes I'll hover the bait over the bottom,
Yeah.
and then you're barely touching. And sometimes you have to play around with, let's say, for instance, you're not catching them on a 1/4 ounce shaky head, but then I start catching them on an 1/8 ounce. That's
Hmm.
also important to play around with.
Yeah. Yeah.
It just moves faster when it's heavier. It's a lot slower when it's lighter,
Yeah.
and
Yeah.
they will let you know. And usually when you get bit and you miss them, you either go up higher or you start dropping a little bit lower. You try to play which way to go,
Hmm.
and then once you see that thing in their throat, then you
Yeah.
got the right weight
Yeah.
and presentation.
Cool.
Yeah, all those little details are so important.
Yeah.
To events, because everybody's throwing a shaky head,
Hmm.
everybody's throwing a Ned, everybody's throwing a swim bait.
Yeah.
Just you figuring out exactly the speed and retrieve. Um, if
Yeah.
I give any advice, is to always remember what your presentation is if you're in search mode. So, for instance, if I'm throwing a frog and now let's just say I'm walking it, I call it tight walk, where the frog
Yeah.
is real tight, tight,
Yeah.
tight, tight. I'm telling myself the whole time, a tight walk, tight walk, tight walk. And then all of a sudden I'm going to try something maybe like a wider walk,
Hmm.
and wide walk. And you're talking to a buddy and kaboof,
Yeah.
you'll remember because you just told
Yeah.
yourself like which retrieve you were. And if you do that, it's so many times where you catch a fish and you go, what the heck was I doing?
Yeah.
And then that was the last fish you caught that day.
Yeah.
That's happened to me in practices where I started developing a better memory,
Yeah.
so to
Yeah.
speak, before the presentation. And that goes with the tube, the worms. Always pay attention to how slow, how fast you were shaking your rod tip. How
Hmm.
um, was it off the bottom? Was it on the bottom? Was it, did you pop it out of the rock like you said?
Yeah.
Um, and always kind of like you're sort of talking to yourself inside while you're fishing, and you'll remember what you were thinking, and then that's how you get better at it. It takes time, but it's so important.
Yeah. Awesome. That's super, super helpful.
Yeah.
So last Shasta question, moving baits. I'm guessing that from time to time and whether spinnerbait may play a role, have glides, small glides or A-rigs played a role for you there?
Yes. Yeah. Glide baits have done well for me there. The 168, is it? The
Yeah.
medium size has been pretty good. Um, I've used a smaller size
Hmm.
quite a few times. It always plays. Yeah, you got to just kind of figure out the same thing with the retrieve uh, that they want it at, especially if. And sometimes you go there and they're just hugging the bottom. You're not
Yeah.
going to catch any
Yeah.
of them up
Mud
there.
on the bellies and
Yeah. So, but it is something that I look for, and it might be that I'm throwing a jerk bait. I'd rather start with like something like a swim bait, and if
hmm
I can get them to bite a swim bait, then I can start playing around with. For instance, if I was swimming the swim bait up high in the water column, then that's the zone that I'm going to target with the glide bait. I haven't got into. I know some of the guys now put weights on their glide bait and get it way
yeah.
down there. I haven't done that on Shasta or anything like that, but um, I'll pick up the glide bait if my swim bait zone is getting bit up higher.
Hmm.
If it's lower, then I'll play around with more jerk baits to check that, and then crankbaits. Another sleeper on those lakes is spinner baits. Underspins are really good. Cool baits,
Hmm.
underspins is also great. Um, I've caught big fish throwing a ounce and a quarter spinner baits on 12-pound test.
Hmm. Slow
Just,
rolling
just because I'm fishing in the
deep
back of the boat
or
and I can cast to the other side of the of the
oh,
of the creek that we're fishing, and I've caught
nice.
some giant fish that way. I'm always like testing opportunities for bigger bites or banks that haven't been touched by the pro I'm
Yeah.
fishing.
Yeah. I like that one. That's a good
Yeah,
one.
that's a good one.
Okay. We've talked about a lot of techniques, and you've talked about working on your weaknesses over the period of time that you were developing your skills as an angler. Um, do you have any weaknesses?
My weakness right now is live scoping. I haven't put that much time into it.
So,
I
from the
start
front of the boat for
from the
clarity,
front from
right?
the front
Yeah.
of the boat. I actually used to tight line a lot as a coangler,
Hmm.
and that technique. I don't think a lot of people did that.
Hmm.
Or now they call it scrolling.
Yeah.
So
Yeah.
I would throw the Kitech, um, and I'd let it hit bottom, and then I'd start shaking my rod tip throughout the water column, and it's not on the bottom. Sometimes I'll ride it lower to the bottom, sometimes mid depth, but kind of practice. If I was practicing the lake, I would practice that way, especially if you're getting no bites on, say, a Kitech, just reeling it.
Yeah.
Now you have to apply action to it. So I used to do that as a co-angler, and um, had several fish that helped me out in events, big ones. Um, where now it's called mid strolling,
Yeah.
but I've caught a few on live scope. But when I finally got the right boat rigged up, ready to go, my son has that boat now in college,
Oh, yeah.
and he's fishing for LSU,
Good
utilizing
for
like
him.
all that the stuff I put on the boat. So now I have one of the boats I kept was the one I won at the Clear Lake in the Bassmasters
Yeah.
2005 Triton.
Yeah.
It's the back of the in my backyard. So I'm not competing as a pro for the next few years, couple of years, until I see what my son's going to do with it.
Okay.
So I don't know if I want to get another boat and do all that again. I'm kind of like taking a break and kind of
Yeah.
enjoying my time.
Yeah.
But I know I need to put the time in with the live scope before I can actually utilize it really good in events. It's very, very important. Like,
Super important right now.
and for now, all I could do is kind of just watch a lot of different tournaments on
Yeah.
live, and it teaches you a lot, quite a bit. So I'm super excited to get back to it and do it again once I have that equipment in my hand. Who knows? If my son continues fishing for the next 3 years, then it'll be 3 years until I do it. My wife keeps saying, "Why don't you just do it now and put it on there now?" So I'm like, I'm kind of old school. I'm like, I already spent
Yeah.
on the best stuff, and then my son has it. So I might, if I
That
get
was
it
generous of you.
right. So we just went and watched one of his events. He actually did really well on day one. They canceled day two, so they gave it to the guy that was leading a day one. But it was super cool to watch him grow into the sport.
Yeah, I bet.
And
That's
then
fantastic.
for now, I'm doing kind of a couple of turkey shoots here and there with Dave Zavar. Actually,
Yeah.
we're having
Yeah.
a good time with it.
Yeah. I bet you guys are a pretty formidable team. That's pretty cool.
Well, we only I think did two events now, and definitely more to come.
Yeah. Awesome. So this has really been absolutely fantastic. I wanted to give you an opportunity to talk about sponsors, how people can follow you, but maybe even before we get there, one last opportunity. Is there anything you were thinking about coming into this that you wanted to convey to people about how you've achieved your consistency across so many different lakes? We've covered a lot of things during this discussion, and so maybe we've already covered it, but are there any key thoughts still in there to be let out?
No, I think I pretty much covered
Yeah.
everything. Though one of the most important things is people always go fishing and practice, and uh, what's very important to me is how you practice. Always,
Mm-hmm.
once you figure out how to catch the fish, say when you're fun fishing, you're not going to really get much out of it if you continue doing that.
Yeah.
So if you kind of throw some of the baits that, for instance, might not work, you kind of want to see how they react to that. So the best thing you're trying to do is get better at practicing. So when you go to these bodies of water and you're throwing a certain technique and you're realizing you're missing these fish, you know exactly what to go to
Mm-hmm.
based on your experience with, testing different baits while uh, let's say I used to think there's only one thing going on the lake when I first started, and there's multiple things going on. So once you start learning how to fish react to certain techniques or certain retrieves, you can make better adjustments during the event
Mm-hmm.
from day to day. So pay attention to that. And it could be just throwing, for instance, a finesse bait, and you're only going to do one thing, let's say a drop shot. Know how to catch them if you're lucky enough to live on the water. Know how to catch them day after day with changing retrieves of that particular finesse bait.
Mm-hmm.
That's super important, because you could be a hero on one day and a zero the next day.
Yeah.
You didn't pick up on, maybe I need to go slower or
Yeah.
faster, and definitely play around with that. If you're not getting bit, say for instance on day two versus day one of the
Mm-hmm.
event,
Mm-hmm.
sooner than later.
Yeah. Right. Right.
Yep.
Okay, cool. So how can people find you? Are you active on social media? Historically, you've been sponsored by Chick-fil-A of Stockton. I don't know if you want to touch on that a little bit
Yeah, no.
before we
So,
close.
yep, sponsored by Chick-fil-A in Stockton. It's actually my wife.
Yep.
That's my big sponsor, and
I didn't know whether you wanted to disclose that, so I didn't say that.
absolutely
But
no. I
yeah,
would love to have any anglers, co or pro, come into our restaurant. I'd love to sit down and share some stories and fishing, and treat you to a Chick-fil-A chicken sandwich. I'd love that.
yeah,
And we're
they're
right
yummy.
off of March Lane in Stockton. So that's the exit to go to Lads, if
Yeah.
you launch out of Lads. So on your way to go fishing, you can always stop by and pick up some sandwiches. If I happen to be there, I'd love to sit down and talk to you. But other sponsors, I've had iRod has been a big sponsor for me for fishing rods throughout the years. I've used a lot of their stuff. That's an excellent rod. One of the biggest things I learned early and as I got older is the lighter the better, because back in the
Feel
day,
better at the end of the day.
yeah, back in the day it was all just beast rods, and
Yeah.
it takes a toll on your hand, elbow and shoulder, and so the lighter the rod the better. And iRod has done that for me for sure throughout the years. And then as far as social media, no, I don't do any of that. I'm kind of busy with the restaurant
Yep.
and but
And winning tournaments.
yeah, and winning tournaments. And but you can definitely follow my son. My son is out there and he does all that social media stuff, and he has the same name, Jack Farage, on Instagram, and you can follow what he's doing. And I'm sure he'll always be very helpful too if you have any questions.
Super. Well, Jack, thanks so much. This has been fantastic. I know people watching this will get a lot of value out of it. I
Awesome.
appreciate you taking your time, and we'll let you go enjoy the rest of the day. And, part of me thinks it may involve having a fishing rod in your hand, given the discussion we've had. But
Right? Yeah. No, I'm looking out there right now. I'm like,
yeah,
oh, the wind kind of calmed down. I might want to go.
go get it, man.
Yeah. Thank you so much for having me. This is amazing. I'm so glad that you're actually doing something like this. I wish I had this when I was doing the CoAngler. And I do have some ideas for you. I saw your notes.
Yeah.
And one of them would be like a lot of these events, they would have pros that sit and kind of talk about how the fisheries fishing. I think it's also important to have, say, a couple of co-anglers that actually went out and practiced, because I didn't get the luxury of practicing for every event, and it kind of helps guys just coming in blind. I've done several events that way, and actually did really well, but it'd be nice to hear from other co-anglers and how their day went, or
Yeah.
just basics. It could be basic stuff if they don't want to share exactly how they're catching them, like color of water. You're going to need light line. Funny thing is, I used to take a tackle bag that had wheels, like you're going to the airport,
Hmm.
because I carried so much stuff because I didn't know what situation I was going to be in, especially on
Yeah.
those events where I didn't practice.
Yeah. And
And
that was to the boat. You had that in the boat with you? So it's like one of those, like the guys would drag onto like a party boat and, the salt water. It
yeah,
sounds like,
yeah, yeah,
I can think of a couple of pros in the circuits we fish who probably weren't super excited about that.
yeah.
But
Well,
that's,
I had built a name for myself, and
yeah,
a lot of them had, I mean, I would say probably 90% of them loved having me on the boat, and
yeah,
10% probably did it.
yeah,
So to me, I've always told them, like, you're always working together. And if you come in with that attitude with the pro, that you're working together to figure out these fish and not worrying about going against each other,
yeah,
that helps out a lot. There's some co-anglers that are, I've heard stories where they're super aggressive,
yep,
and they're trying to beat their pro for a cast or whatever.
yeah.
And you're not going to learn much from it.
Never ends well.
Never ends well. And I never had to do that. And I've won 7 boats,
Yeah,
2 Wild Wests, and almost a championship and Angler of the Year without having to do any of that.
yep,
So you can get just as good by fishing your own water and doing your own thing from the back of.
yep. And it's always better to have the guy at the pointy end want to fish with you again in the future.
Exactly. Yeah. And
And
definitely,
good things will happen if they feel that way about you.
yes. And I've even shared baits.
Yeah,
Um,
me too.
some tournaments I've shared spots that I was able to do, like FLW. You're allowed to give away your spot, where I couldn't go back to it because he was so nice to me.
Yeah.
So I've put a few pros in the top 10s by doing that.
Wow.
And it paid paid back because they spoke highly of me to other
Yeah.
people. When they drew me, they remembered that story. So
Yeah.
it goes a long way with being like good help to the pro, and always pay attention to what they're doing, especially if you're getting your butt kicked by them,
Yeah.
because that should be a technique that you need to get good at,
Yeah.
obviously, because you're not good at it at the
Yeah.
moment, right?
Yeah.
So pay attention to that. Always look at it as a guided trip
Mm-hmm.
and go in with a positive attitude, not a negative attitude, especially listening to what he has to say as far as what he's going to do for the day. For instance, if they say, I'm just going to bed fish all day, some of the guys get really negative, and I've had some amazing opportunities while people are bed fishing, caught 9-pounders
Yeah.
casting out in the middle of the lake while they're looking at a 3-pounder. So
Wow.
there's always opportunities. Be positive and definitely ask the right questions before you jump in the boat with a pro. That's super huge. Some of them might not want to give up what they're doing, but at least ask if you're going to be in dirty water, which would help you with choosing darker baits or whatnot, or if he's going to be fishing fast, moving fast. So get a couple of good questions before you get on the boat with the pro, and always tip well at the end. I always give gas money and then some, especially if I was going to win. I've gave several boaters over $100 just because they put me in good positions a lot of
Mm-hmm.
times. And sometimes I didn't win, and I still gave them a lot of my
Yeah.
a lot of my
Yeah.
winnings because they were nice enough to give me the opportunity. I've had pros that did really bad on day one and kind of gave me the boat for the rest of the day, where they did the trolling motor and they put me in position, and some of those became some of my good friends
Yeah.
in the past. So
That's
uh,
awesome.
there's always an opportunity
Yeah.
to have fun.
Yeah. All right. Well, thank you for the idea. I mean, to be honest, I've been thinking about some things that are not exactly that, but kind of like that, in the sense that I think the opportunities for co-anglers to communicate with each other sometimes are less than the opportunities for co-anglers to communicate with pros that maybe they're traveling or practicing with, or who they fish with at the tournament. I mean,
Yes,
obviously, as a co-angler over time, you develop a network
that's a
of
whole
other co-anglers, but you don't know all of them.
that's a whole another subject. Yes,
Yeah.
that's important who you travel with. I've traveled with people where you start winning and they kind of like shut down. They don't want to tell you much.
Mm-hmm.
So I've always been the guy that I always shared information with everybody in the house that I
Yeah.
was with.
Yeah.
If I felt like that person wasn't sharing back,
Yeah.
that person was no longer in my circle of.
Right.
I mean, they were continued to be friends, but um, it's fishing is tough as it is, and to have somebody to kind of tell you the wrong thing, it makes it worse.
Yeah, for
So
sure.
I've learned
Yeah.
to, and you learn that throughout the years, who's honest, who's not honest, and um, you're
Yeah.
never, yeah, you're. Well, I've been in tournaments where I, three co-anglers that I was rooming with were in the top 10
Mm-hmm.
because we all work together.
Yeah.
And I've been in tournaments where I sucked, but my buddy was in the top 10, and he ended up fishing with a certain person, came back and shared everything that he did.
Mm-hmm.
And then I happened to draw that guy in another event, and
Mm-hmm.
that particular situation came up again.
Mm-hmm.
Like, for instance, that his style of fishing
Mm-hmm.
based on what my am buddy had told me.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
So
Mm-hmm.
that also helped. Or, for instance, it could have been a technique that they learned
Yeah.
from a pro and come back and shared it
Yeah.
with you after the event. And then you went out and practiced that technique. And now, instead of learning from 3 pros in that event, you learn from
Yeah.
6 pros.
Yeah.
You sort of take your notes and build your techniques, and it makes it more fun when everybody's winning
Yeah.
and
Yeah.
sharing.
Yeah. Well, that's great advice. I think your idea about trying to communicate what's working in practice is a super interesting one. to coanglers, having somebody speak about it as an interesting idea. We're I think taking baby steps. We're starting by, leading up to this BAM Pro-Am. We've got the podcast with Dave Zavar, got this podcast, probably going to do a couple others with people who have had success from the back of the boat on the Delta as a way for people to get familiar with the fishery. In terms of the, 2 days before conditions, I don't think we're going to be positioned to do exactly what you're suggesting this year. But I do want to, we've been thinking about trying to put together in a manner consistent with tournament rules, a broadly accessible sort of private social network for coanglers. That could be a way for people to, and they can decide how much they want to share or not share, but it could be a way for people to meet other coanglers, get to know them better, in between tournaments, potentially exchange some of the kind of information about techniques and things that could help people become better fishermen. At the end of the day, what you do on the water is the most important, for sure. Your practice time there, but I do think there are some things like the conversation we're having now, which I think is going to help a lot of people who view this. So I really appreciate your time.
Of course.
So
My pleasure.
So anyway, I see you eyeing that lake out of the side of your eye. I'll let you get to it. I'm going to stop this recording and we'll start working on editing it and making it available to people. But thanks again, Jack.
Awesome. Thank you for
Wonder to have you here.
Thank you.
You've been listening to the CoAnglers Garage podcast, recorded May 7th, 2025 with Jack Farage. I hope you enjoyed that as much as I did. If you're new to CoAngler's Garage, our goals are to give coanglers a greater voice in the tournament community. Second, to build community amongst coanglers, both regionally and across the country. Third, to help us all become better tournament anglers by learning from each other. We'd appreciate it if you'd take a moment and please like and subscribe to this channel. And also, come visit us elsewhere on social media. We're on Instagram and Facebook at CoAnglers Garage. Thanks for listening. We'll see you next time.